Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome Patrice Darrington to start the program.
Welcome. Within the Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation is a real estate development program, which, contrary to common opinion, is not singularly focused on making profits in real estate. But rather, in the MSRED program, we guide and encourage our students to understand the impact of the built environment on people and communities, and especially where there is inequality and oppression inherent in the work of real estate development. Evidence of this is the work of some of our illustrious African-American alumni, such as Ernst Valerie in Baltimore, Cecily King, who has been working in Detroit, and Diane Branch, the class of 2003, who today has worked with our program faculty, Ed Potiet, to create an ongoing symposium for our students and also our guests on the inequality that we have within our African American communities associated with real estate. Today's session is specifically on the impact of redlining on Black Americans. This is hosted by Diane with some extraordinary guests to discuss this critical issue. Welcome, Diane.
Diane, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Patrice. This webinar on redlining is the first in a series on Black Americans and real estate. Before we get to our distinguished panelists, I just want to share some background. To tell the true story of systematic racism and redlining in this country, it is important to explain the role that real estate plays in creating the wealth gap between Black and white America. The Federal Reserve Board reports that the median median net worth of white households in 2016 was $171,000. This is about 10 times higher than the median net worth at that time of Black households, which was $17,600. According to the Brookings Institute, in a report, it stated that the barriers to Black households in buying homes has created a cumulative wealth disparity over time. In 2015, the median non-Hispanic white homeowner had $100,000 of home equity, as compared to the median Black homeowners' equity, which was slightly more than half that much at $56,000. So we have a lot to cover. Let's go to our distinguished panelists. I'll give you their background in order of their speaking. Dr. Kevin Magruder is an associate professor of history at Antioch College. He received an MBA in real estate finance from Columbia University Business School in 1984. Dr. Magruder is the author of Race and Real Estate, Conflict and Cooperation in Harlem, 1890 to 1992. In the 1990s, he was director of real estate development for the Abyssinian Development Corporation, a nonprofit church-based organization. Dr. Brian Goldstein is an assistant professor of architectural history at Swarthmore College. He received national recognition for exemplifying scholarship in planning sustainable development. His book, The Roots of Urban Renaissance, Gentrification, and the Struggle Over Harlem, which chronicles the history of community-based efforts to shape the neighborhood's redevelopment from the early 1960s to the early 2000s, recently received the 2020 John Friedman Book Award from the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning. His current book project is on the life and work of the celebrated Black architect, J. Max Bond, Jr. Dr. Andre Perry is a senior fellow in the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings, a scholar in residence at American University, and a columnist for the Hechinger Report. He is the author of the book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. His research focuses on race and structural inequality, education, and economic inclusion. Dr. Perry's recent scholarship at Brookings has analyzed Black majority sister cities and institutions in America, focusing on valuable assets worthy of increased investment. Well, we have a lot to cover, so I will start with Dr. Magruder. Kevin, what is race redlining? And what does it have to do with Black wealth?
Yes, the question of the hour. I received an article recently. It's called New Perspectives on New Deal Housing Policy, Explicating and Mapping the Homeowners Loan Corporation Loans to African Americans. And it's by Todd Michney and Ladale Winling. And it has a very concise answer to that question. So I'm going to take a couple minutes and read some excerpts from the article, and then I'll talk about how my research intersects with it. And so as they're answering that question, what is redlining, they give some background. The Homeowners Loan Corporation was created as a provision of the Homeowners Loan Act, passed in June of 1933, near the end of the first 100 days of the New Deal legislation. And so you may know that when FDR comes into office during the Depression, unemployment nationally is 25%, in the Black community is 50%. People have lost their homes, and so this is an intervention during that first 100 days. Administered by the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, it was empowered to refinance the mortgages of non-farm homes to a maximum of $14,000. Using bonds issued to lenders. These bonds were fully insured by the government. The refinanced mortgages were 15-year, fully amortized loans, meaning the principal was repaid simultaneously with the interest. This arrangement, more favorable to borrowers, had been pioneered by savings and loans, small shareholder-owned banks and thrifts, starting in the 1920s, and was a reform widely called for by the New Deal housing policy advisors. Before this, typical home purchase financing was 5 to 10 years, interest only, with the balloon payment of the principal at the end. And people paid that either by refinancing again. That's really the only way in most cases. Often they had to pay 50% down. And so the kind of long-term mortgages that we're familiar with now just were not available until this period. Most lenders agreed to turn over their mortgage holdings for government bonds, despite a lower profit margin, because a return on their investment was assured, which had previously not at all been certain, considering the large number of delinquent borrowers facing foreclosure at the time. The Homeowners Loan Corporation proved extremely popular. By the time the agency stopped accepting applications during this first wave, on June 17, 1935, some 40% of the entire country's eligible homeowners had applied, with more than half receiving loans. That was over 1 million people in all. By 1936, the Homeowners Loan Corporation held more than 20% of all mortgages on non-farm dwellings. With its rescue phase ended, the Homeowners Loan Corporation shifted focus to managing the considerable inventory of properties on which it now held the mortgages, as well as compiling information its staff believed could prove useful in shoring up the housing market well into the future. It was then that the agency's Mortgagee Rehabilitation Division, which was created in July of 1935, initiated city surveys, mapping the locations of non-white and other neighborhoods considered to be poor future investment risk. In the Homeowner Loan Corporation 4-color system of letter grades, red or D neighborhoods were the lowest rated, hence the term redlining, since mortgage underwriting was thereby discouraged in such areas. And just to look at the full scale of the rating, A, the top was green, and that meant best. Blue was still desirable. C, the third was definitely declining was yellow, and red was known as hazardous. Even before the mapping, there had been complaints of racial discrimination within that program. In 1934, the Cincinnati NAACP charged, after an investigation, that the local homeowners loan corporation was systematically undervaluing Black-owned properties. And this is going to align with Andre's research, indiscriminately labeling African-American neighborhoods as blighted and flagging applications by non-whites as colored. Complaints relating to an all-Black housing development in Jamaica, Queens, New York, had led the NAACP to persist in its inquiries, despite the FHA's insistence that it did not discriminate. Lead attorney Thurgood Marshall then got the local administrator to admit that the FHA designated white and Negro areas where insured loans could be secured only by members of those groups, and that it considered racially mixed neighborhoods to be cushion areas where it would guarantee no loans at all. Furthermore, in the Negro areas where it did underwrite loans, FHA would not insure those on properties valued significantly higher than the average. And the authors of this article, they conclude by saying by federalizing longstanding discriminatory practices in the mainstream real estate industry and applying a veneer of social scientific methodology to property valuation, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, along with the Federal Housing Administration, helped to perpetuate a still persistent belief among whites that the presence of African Americans invariably depreciates home prices. Furthermore, by closely regulating the extent and restricting where Black borrowers could take advantage of state-backed home ownership supports, the Home Loaners Corporation, the FHA, and later the Veterans Administration contributed to a long-standing Black-white wealth gap that has yawned increasingly wide in recent decades. And so that is kind of the backdrop to what Diane was talking about. My research looks at the 3 decades before this. In looking at Harlem, 1890 to 1920, what we see in that is the making of this process, that the Depression era belief that the presence of Blacks reduced property values didn't come out of kind of thin air. It was being developed from the 1890s forward. And so what I look at in Race and Real Estate is a period in Harlem, 1890 to 1920. So before 1900, 90% of Black people lived in the South. In New York, after 1900, the numbers are increasing. After 1904, with the opening of the subway, as Black people moved to New York, they're moving to Harlem. What we see at the beginning of that period, if you look at 135th Street, if you're familiar with Harlem, the south side of 135th between Lenox and Fifth Avenue, there were a row of walk-up tenement buildings there. And that block, 134th, 133rd, were areas where Black people predominated, but they weren't only there. And that's what you see in many northern cities in around 1900. Black people can't live anywhere, but they do live in different places. They're often confined in certain areas. And in Harlem, what we see is that in those areas, there are all Black buildings. There are some all white buildings. There are some buildings in Harlem where Black people and white people live in the same building. In some cases, they live in the same apartment. And so there's the racial residential patterns are somewhat fluid. That begins to change in Harlem when the subway opens and the number of Black people in the area increase. And what happens is the hostility against them grows. And so what we see in the decade between 1904 and 1914, growing hostility, defense practices that white residents who are hostile develop. And one of the main one is a restrictive covenants. The first one I found in the area was 1907, where a group of 23 residents on 137th Street between Lenox Avenue and 7th Avenue enter into a covenant that's placed in their deeds that they won't rent, sell, allow Black people to occupy their buildings. And so what they're doing is trying to establish a white terrain when one had not existed before. And when you look at the text of the covenants, they explain why they're doing it, because they do understand that they may be brought to court, and they say, oh, it's not racial discrimination, we just want to stabilize the market. And so implicit in that is a belief that as Black people move into areas that have been predominantly white, the market is becoming unstable. One of the reasons the subtitle of my book is Conflict and Cooperation is because what I found, we tend to know the hostility, but we don't know the cooperative elements from white people in areas where Black people are moving. In Harlem, there are a handful of white property owners who sell to Black people, and not only sell, they take back mortgages to help those Black people buy those properties. And so there is a cooperative element. In 1913 in Harlem, Erdwin Bonderhorst Koch, who was the head of the Harlem Board of Commerce, at one point he says that the Negroes have a right to live and the privilege of going to Fifth Avenue or Riverside Drive if they can pay for it. Many obnoxious things have arisen from antagonisms stirred up between the two races. And so it's not a uniform hostility. There is a mix, but it becomes more hostile as we move into the teens. And this is happening across the nation, somewhat different times, but around this period. What's also happening is a parallel professionalizing of the real estate brokerage industry. The National Association of Realtors is created. Black people could not be in that organization, and they could not call themselves realtors. So Black people in 1947, they formed their own organization. They call themselves realtists. This becomes codified, what I would call writing race into housing, and the patterns that we see with redlining of the FHA during the Depression. In 1924, the National Association of Realtors Code of Ethics, Article 34 of it, where they're saying what realtors can and cannot do. A realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. And so they believe social scientists are backing this belief up. And so that really sets the stage for 9 years later, when the Homeowners Loan Corporation does this rating. They believe it's backed by social science then. And so I'll leave things there, and Brian is going to kind of continue the story around Harlem in the decades later.
I also like to introduce Brian again. Brian has been working on the book on J. Max Brown. I'm not sure if that was clear when I said before, and not sure if I gave his full background. Brian is assistant professor of archaeology history at Swarthmore. He's received national recognition for exemplifying sustainable development. Brian.
Thanks, Diane. I'm going to share my screen.
Good to go.
Okay, so I do want to thank Diane and the organizers for inviting me here today, and also Andre and Kevin. I look forward to our conversation that will follow. And certainly thanks to all the audience for attending. My remarks will focus on the impact of redlining in the post-World War II era, especially the consequences that redlining and the world that produced redlining wrought 2 and 3 decades after creation of the HOLC residential security maps in the 1930s. And as Kevin said, my research also focuses on Harlem, and I'll use Harlem as a case over the next few minutes, although the dynamics that played out in Harlem weren't unique. They were pretty typical of the way redlining unfolded for urban Black Americans in the mid-20th century. In particular, my interest is in the history of redevelopment in Harlem and the ways that Harlem residents worked to shape the transformation of the built environment. And I write about this extensively in my book, The Roots of Urban Renaissance. But for today, I wanted to hone in on three aspects that show a more complicated picture of redlining's legacy than perhaps we might expect. And this is my main argument. Redlining created reverberations that were certainly extraordinarily detrimental in ways that extended well beyond mortgage lending, but also seeded movements for self-determination and community control that were remarkable in their imagination and ambition. Ultimately, Harlem's limited access to traditional forms of capital created great turbulence in the neighborhood, and ultimately that left dreams of Black power incomplete in their realization. So first, I want to speak to some negative consequences and focus especially on post-war urban redevelopment, which is popularly called urban renewal. Kind of in statute, those were different, but we use them interchangeably, so I'll do the same. Urban renewal involved the large-scale federally backed clearance and reconstruction of urban blocks, often replacing dense, aged housing with modern developments for low-income or middle-class residents, civic centers, stadiums, office buildings, and other uses too. Urban renewal arose from pretty complicated circumstances. We have to sort of be realistic to understand that cities were struggling at this same moment with rapid suburbanization, accelerating deindustrialization, and certainly places like New York and Boston and Chicago, Newark, many of the cities that really jumped into urban renewal were struggling with how to retain a viable tax base. Urban renewal was one of those responses to that struggle. And here I'm just showing you a photo of the clearance of Lincoln Center downtown from Harlem, but a good photographic record of what this looked like in practice. The reality is that urban renewal was not equal in its costs. In New York, as elsewhere, it disproportionately targeted low-income communities and often communities of color, and that was certainly the case in Harlem. Urban renewal reconstructed hundreds of Harlem's acres. To point to just one example, in the area east of Fifth Avenue, officials cleared 162 acres of dense blocks to build 15 public housing projects between 1941 and 1965. So what does this have to do with redlining? Well, no one cause drew officials to clear and reconstruct these dense blocks in places like Manhattan's predominantly Black and Puerto Rican West Side or uptown in Harlem. Racism, expediency, and differential political power all played a role. But so too did deteriorated building conditions, which were often filtered through the invented category of urban blight. I call it an invented category because blight it's something that happens to plants. It's a biological metaphor that's then adopted in the context of planning and development. But buildings, of course, don't naturally deteriorate. The elimination of blight was a legally justifiable use of eminent domain powers, and those powers allowed officials to take land and buildings from one private owner, clear it, and then give it to another public or private owner, displacing residents who in Harlem were mostly African American. In many ways, the physical deterioration of Harlem was exacerbated by redlining. Already in 1937, the assessor of area number 26, which the assessment's shown here in the middle of my slide, those are the Harlem blocks circled in my map, and they include the neighborhood's original node of Black settlement, which Kevin just described to you. That assessment pretty much cemented the neighborhood's fate. The assessor described an area that was 90% Black. It was crowded amid a racist housing market and in, as he described it, fair to poor repair. He graded the area a D. As you now know, that was the worst assessment, effectively assuring that owners would have little access to the capital they would have needed to maintain or upgrade buildings. And indeed, when in 1957, officials announced the project that would become Lenox Terrace, a middle-class African-American development within these boundaries at 135th and Lenox, the very same intersection you just heard about in Kevin's presentation. The New York Times described the effort as, quote, slum clearance and as a replacement of, quote, blighted properties. So thinking about this neighborhood as slums, as blight. With private mortgage financing absent here until banks got involved in this project, something that the project's backers celebrated, banks are suddenly willing to invest because they have the benefit of public money to clear the blocks. This outcome was pretty much foreordained. And it was hardly unusual. One recent analysis that paired HOLC maps and many, but not all of the urban renewal projects on the books found that 47% of redevelopment projects and 70% of New York City public housing, the kind of close cousin of urban renewal, was constructed in D-rated areas. And in my squares here in the box, you see the area that's Harlem specifically. Assessors created a self-fulfilling prophecy, and in a lot of cases, urban renewal finished the job. Now, for an unexpected outcome of redlining, Harlem was frequently subject to the decisions of outsiders, with urban renewal one symbolic example and perhaps the most disruptive. But Harlemites were not powerless in the face of redevelopment. Following the habits of mid-century racial liberalism and the class politics of a segregated but certainly not monolithic community, some Harlemites, ministers, politicians, business leaders, even supported and encouraged urban renewal. They saw it as a way to bring in public and private dollars in an otherwise underinvested community. And for that group, the kind of racial liberals, government involvement could be a tool in the struggle for civil rights. If we think of something like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that suggests a government remedy to the problems of civil rights. And sort of surprisingly, maybe for some of us, urban renewal was also seen by many as such a tool. But over the course of the 1960s, a younger generation of civil rights activists came to a very different understanding. They saw Harlem and similar majority Black communities as victims of racist domination, in which countries like Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya had all gained their independence from colonial rule. And so they saw great power and potential in the identity that redlining and other means of racial exclusion had created in segregated neighborhoods. To put it simply, they saw these kind of these in-city colonies, as many describe them, as sources of power. Most vividly, this took shape in the philosophy of Black power, whose leading advocates, like the activist Stokely Carmichael, pictured here, saw Harlem as a base for claiming racial self-determination and creating new kinds of organizations to demand community control. As Carmichael and Charles V. Hamilton explained in their 1967 book, Black Power, Black Americans had seen urban planners and schools and police all neglect their needs. Now they wrote, quote, "We must devise new structures, new institutions to replace those forms or to make them responsive," unquote. Those new structures took the shape of community school boards, experiments in grassroots urban planning, and new approaches to development that met Harlem's physical dilapidation and capital deficits with creative imagination. In my limited time, I want to highlight just one of those new forms, the Community Development Corporation, often called the CDC. CDCs took the philosophy of Black power and community control into real estate and business development, arguing, in short, that highly segregated communities like Harlem did not need the capital of outsiders and the often harmful influence that came with that capital. Instead, among their thousands of residents, they claimed they already had the means to build what such communities most needed. We can kind of think of this as a response to redlining, not to say we need outside capital as a solution to redlining, but we need to harvest our own capital. Harlem became the site of one of the first such groups called the Harlem Commonwealth Council and launched in 1967. HCC emerged preaching a gospel combining equal parts market orientation and mutual aid, with initial ventures including a small foundry, sewing store, pharmacy, travel agency, and office furniture store, all seen to meet local needs of different sorts. But crucially, the financial engine for such ventures, initially funded with foundation money, was to be the sale of $5 shares to residents to be used to procure larger loans. This 1972 advertisement in the New York Amsterdam News, New York's Black paper, suggested all the promise of an organization where residents would self-fund local investments whose profits were to then flow back into the community. Support your community, you can see it says in the opening line. Get involved. Most symbolically, HCC promised that residents could own a piece of the block. Mortgage discrimination and other technologies of racial segregation had created monoracial communities that struggled to gain resources from private banks. Inadvertently, those conditions seeded a wave of community development corporations across American cities. The Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Corporation in Brooklyn, Huff Area Development Corporation in Cleveland, Anacostia Economic Development Corporation in DC, and Union Sarah Economic Development Corporation in St. Louis were just some of the few that came up in this era. Many pursued business developments, others pursued housing, and they encompassed not just African-American communities, but also other communities that had suffered from years of lack of access to capital, Latinx communities, Asian American communities, and Native American communities too. But the path these organizations would walk was never as simple as realizing utopian dreams of community control and grassroots economic development in the face of racist lending. Local funding was slow, hard work, and their community orientation appealed to officials across the political spectrum who shared a post-1960s goal of reducing government's role in urban policy. So one effect was that new federal programs sprang up to provide venture capital to community development corporations and otherwise get out of their way. As scholars have explained in the context of housing as well, opening spigots that had been largely shut off did not simply reverse the harms of years of discrimination. For the Harlem Commonwealth Council, a flood of money from the government allowed bigger investments like an office building on 125th Street that the group purchased, but also reduced accountability to the community it was to serve. Without shareholders to guide its work, the organization became increasingly focused on commercial development and ever less motivated to sell ownership shares. This is a much more complicated story than I can get into today, though it's something I do describe in my Harlem book extensively. And without a stock sale ever happening, Harlemites did not gain the capital or the self-determination they were promised. When those public funding sources dried up, and they did in the early 1980s after Reagan's election, early community development corporations had very little to fall back on. And once private funding began to flow more steadily to communities like Harlem in the mid-80s, into a new generation of community development corporations focused on housing, a generation that included the Abyssinian Development Corporation, which we could certainly talk more about. It often came with strings attached. Private bank-backed entities like the New York City Housing Partnership funded housing in Harlem with a specific focus on increasing middle-class home ownership, which banks saw as a safe investment for their green-lined dollars. They really wouldn't invest directly in low-income housing except through intermediaries like the low-income housing tax credit, other groups like that. Direct funding generally favored home ownership. That goal helped gradually shift the economic composition of Harlem's residents. That was an outcome that met the desires of some Harlemites, but which others saw as the sunset of their dream of a community rebuilt by and for its longtime residents. Once gentrification comes into a story, things get messy quickly, and perhaps we can take up the connection between redlining and gentrification in our conversation later. For now, and by way of conclusion, I'll simply point out that Harlem's turbulent relationship to outside capital brought turbulence inside its borders too, with effects continuing for years after the neighborhood's blocks were delineated in red, and even for years after efforts that promised community reinvestment. After the cake was baked, it proved impossible to simply add back in the missing ingredient. Harlemites have a history of creatively making the best of what they have, but redlining casts a long shadow. So with that, I just want to thank you again, and I will look forward to our discussion in a few minutes.
We can have Andre next. Andre, your work talks about today, the result of redlining and what our communities are looking like, and is there hope for a different a resurge or an energy in those communities? So I turn to you.
Yes, so thank you, Diane. And I also like to thank Kevin and Brian for their wonderful presentations. I learned a lot there. And I think I'll present something that resonates a lot with your work. And so I'll begin with my presentation. Hopefully you can all see my screen. Okay.
Perfect.
Yep. And a lot of this can be found in my book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities, available wherever fine books are sold. I study Black majority cities, places where the share of the Black population is greater than 50%. I also study Black majority neighborhoods, but there are obviously too many of those to put on a map, but you can see there are a lot of majority Black cities. There's more than 1,200 of them But today I'm going to talk about a little bit about homes and the impact of racism on those Black cities and places. This is where where I grew up. This is where, like most good stories, they begin at home. This is 1320 Hill Avenue, Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania. Wilkinsburg is a small Black majority municipality surrounded by Pittsburgh on three sides. And you can see the home is in disrepair. It's boarded up. The roof is bowed. You can get this home if you want it by agreeing to pay the taxes to the municipality of Wilkinsburg. But it for me, it's worth so much more. This woman on the upper right-hand corner, her name is Elsie Boyd. I call her Mom. As the story was told when I was born, she made a deal with my maternal grandmother that she would take me in. Because my mother was poor. She already had a child when she was 15. She had me when she was 17. She was probably abused. And so Mom did what a lot of Black women did during that period. She filled the breach that government or private industry did not. She took in kids. And as you can see, there were a lot of kids that she took care of in 1320 Hill Avenue, some Black, some white. One of the reasons why she did this is my father, Floyd Criswell. He was a heroin addict, and he was in and out of prison for most of his young life. He died. He was killed in prison a day before his 27th birthday in Jackson State Penitentiary, right outside Detroit, near where he was born. He bounced from Detroit to Pittsburgh all throughout his life. For my book, I actually followed where he lived to get a sense, and where Mom lived, to get a sense of the conditions they lived under. And to save, I actually have slides on all of these circles, but because so many of it was explained, I'm just going to breeze past them. But they lived in areas that were redlined, where Homeowner Loan Corporation drew red lines around their neighborhoods. He lived in areas where areas where highway construction barreled through Black neighborhoods, destroying commercial corridors and neighborhoods. They lived in areas where there was urban renewal. They had to bounce from neighborhood. That's actually how my family ended up in Wilkinsburg. An urban renewal project. There was predatory lending in the form of, in particular, rent-to-own schemes that were throughout where they lived. And there were restrictive housing covenants, so racial housing covenants. So they could not move to lots of areas around them because they were prohibited by law to do so. Now, but I wanted to look at the impact of these things on current home prices. So if you can look at this chart, this is a chart of home values by zip code. And then as you can see on that bottom axis, that x-axis, that's the percent of Black people within a neighborhood or zip code. And on the y-axis, as indicated by the price on top of the bars, that's the average list price of homes in those neighborhoods. So as you can see, homes in areas where the share of the Black population is less than 1%, on average are priced about $340,000. And they're about half as much in areas where the Black population is 50% or higher. Now, a lot of people will say that's because of education, that's because of crime. But those are things that you can control for in a study, and that's what we did. We looked at that absolute price, but we controlled for structural characteristics. So we looked at the square footage, number of rooms, for instance, because we really wanted to get an apples to apples comparison between the homes, so same kinds of homes, and look at the price. But then we control for neighborhood amenities. We control for education, crime, walkability, all those fancy Zillow metrics, to get an apples to apples comparison. And what we found is that homes in Black neighborhoods where the share of the Black population is on average are underpriced by 23%, about 48,000 per home. Cumulatively, that's about 156 billion in lost equity. And you can see wherever this is occurring all across the United States, wherever you see a magenta circle, that's where devaluation is occurring. Wherever you see a green circle, that's where homes in Black neighborhoods are priced higher than in the metro areas than their white counterparts. Just to give you a sense of the Newark, New Jersey City metro, there's about a 10% difference, about 48,000 per home in the area. But you can see this, there's rangy differences all across the United States. Lynchburg, for instance, 81% different. Rochester, New York, 65% different. So again, if you helicoptered a home in a Black neighborhood and put it in a white neighborhood of similar social circumstances, it would increase in value by that much. Detroit, the largest Black city in terms of population and size, 37%. But there are places where the share of that homes in Black neighborhoods are priced higher. Nashville plus 10, Wichita Falls plus 16, Boston plus 23. But I always tell people, no, Boston is not less racist than Lynchburg, but the home prices are higher. Now, I just want to put this 156 billion in perspective. What does it mean? What does it look like? 156 billion would have financed more than 4 million Black-owned businesses based on the average amount Black people use to start up their firms. It would have financed more than 8 million four-year degrees based on the average amount, a cost of a four-year public education. Replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan, 3,000 times over, nearly covered all of Hurricane Katrina damage, and it's double the annual economic burden of the opioid crisis. You know, why all of you should pay attention to this, and it's the reason why I put this last bullet there, and the reason why I talked about my personal story in the beginning. If my father lived in a neighborhood where there was not housing discrimination, he would have better opportunities. He would have better schools, better infrastructure, more capacity to start a business, to go to college. His life would have been different. And I never excuse his behaviors. He probably abused my mother. But without question that if he lived in areas without housing discrimination, his life would be different. My life would be different. My wealth status would be different. And so I wanted to highlight this point, because so often we blame Black people for the conditions in Black neighborhoods. This is why I say all the time that there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. We need to stop blaming people when things go awry and really look at policy and ways to change policy. Now, my research shows that there's still discrimination of some sort in the market. Still, one of the legacies of redlining, yes, it certainly robbed people of material worth, but it set a horrible template of saying that Black people are not worthy of investment. And we see that time and time again in different aspects of the housing market, in banking, and in other areas. Black people are not worthy. They are hazardous, not deserving of investment. I'm going to just play this one clip in closing. And this is Representative Al Green of Texas. I had the opportunity of presenting to the Financial Services Committee a few years ago. I actually just presented early this month on a similar issue, but he asked a basic question. Do we feel that there's discrimination in appraisals? And now, if you've been paying attention to the news, you've seen individual cases of racism in various areas in which a homeowner replaced themselves with a white stand-in, and the second appraised appraisal came in hundreds of thousands of dollars higher. But I just want to play this clip so that folks can get a sense of the mindset that it is in the real estate industry.
If you think Black people are being discriminated when their property is being appraised, would you kindly raise your hand? One person on the panel. If you think that, for fear that I'm not communicating well, if you think that Black people are not being discriminated against when their property is being appraised, if you think they're not being discriminated against, kindly raise your hand. Okay, hands now, we're getting some consternation, I see.
You know, when I was listening to Kevin and Brian, so much of their research just really resonated with what I've been studying time and time again. And I will say that the other part of this is that communities are organizing. And I titled my book, Know Your Price, based off my favorite play in the whole wide world, Two Trains Running, by the great August Wilson. In the play, there's a character by the name of Memphis, and Memphis is about to have his property seized through eminent domain. And the city of Pittsburgh offers Memphis $15,000 for his property, to which Memphis says, no, I'm not selling my property. I know my price. I got my price. I'm paraphrasing, but it's a refrain throughout the play. There's another character, Hambone, who paints a fence for a ham in exchange for a ham. So he paints the fence, but he never gets his ham. And throughout the play, he says, give me my ham, give me my ham, give me my ham. And we don't know if he had mental illness before he painted the fence, but eventually goes crazy and dies demanding his ham. Now, there's actually a happy ending. I know you're like, well, damn, that's a sad story. But the happy ending is that Memphis gets $35,000, well above his asking price. And the moral of the story is this: you got to know that you have worth. And what my book, Know Your Price, tries to do is give people the price to stand on. But at the end of the day, you got to know that you have worth, and you have to fight for it, even if it means going crazy and dying. And so I'm going to close there because I'm looking forward to this conversation. But yeah, you got to know your value, know your worth, because just like in housing, we are more valuable than we are priced. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you all. Wonderful conversation. I just have one question before we turn to the audience. We've established this redlining. We've established its results in the community. We also didn't talk, but there are a number of subsidies that were given in this country to whites that Blacks didn't get. Why is it that when you have this discussion about equalizing, about looking to the community to help, I won't say the word reparations, I like to say reckoning. People really jump at that. Why is there such a, people just don't want to deal with it? They say it's wrong. Why would we help them? So I asked you all that question.
I think because the veterans, World War II veterans who got the VA loans that allowed them to get houses in the suburb, they think that they got those houses just because of their hard work. And they don't recognize the fact that they didn't have Black neighbors because Black people couldn't even get out there. And they were denied VA loans in many cases. And so that's why this history is so important. And that congressional hearing showed, like, those people raising their hand, they probably never even heard of the history, but even if they had, it will take a lot for them to understand how they're living it and they're benefiting from it. And people have a hard time realizing that they got privileges. And America is pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. That's what people think. But nobody did that in this country. And they don't want to admit it.
And maybe just to add to that, the subsidy for ownership continues at a much greater scale than any other kind of public subsidy for housing, certainly more than goes into affordable or low income or public housing. But it's an invisible subsidy. It described as public housing. It's described as private housing, to Kevin's point. Yeah, and homes, as I often tell my students, buying a house is it's the easiest investment in a world where investing is really complicated. For the most part in the United States, if you put money into a house, at some point you gain your money back and more, and that's relatively straightforward, and people are hyper protective of that particular investment. And I think because race has long been conflated with value, as Andre shows us well, that calculation, that risk calculation, becomes racialized and has stayed that way for 90 years now, 100 years.
I have a slightly, it's not a different take, but I actually think most people believe in reparations, especially white people, because when you saw the PPP loan, or after being socially distanced for a few weeks, the business community said, federal government, you need to bail us out. You need to help us. You need to repair, because you're asking us to shut down. How are you going to repair? So we believe in reparations. In fact, we've seen it recently with 9/11 victims. We've seen it to a certain extent with the Japanese internment. We've seen it with Native Americans, and certainly not the kind of reparations that we want, but we believe in it. But when it comes to Black people, it's like, no, that's too much. I didn't pay for slaves. I didn't do, and you hear all these silly, absolutely silly reasons why not to do it, when we do it every day, particularly for white suffering. So for me, it's like, we got to be clear how we've racialized the term reparations, but in practice, we repair injured communities all the time. But when it comes to Black people, then it's a problem.
What would you all tell the Biden administration? Biden in January issued a memo to HUD and asked HUD to look at any possible destruction that the last administration might have done to the Federal Fair Housing Act. But what is really important, we've got about, I think, 5 minutes. What's important? What would you tell Biden about looking at this problem? Kevin?
I would suggest putting some pressure on the industry professional organizations. When I looked at the National Association of Realtors website last week, they were encouraging their brokers to volunteer to take implicit bias tests. They should push that so it's not voluntary. When I looked at there's a National Appraisers Organization, I saw the clip that Andre played today, I saw it. But I looked at how that National Appraisers Organization responded to that hearing, and it was just bluster and, oh, they don't know, it's ridiculous research. That HUD and that federal money has the possibility of pushing them. And I do think the Black Lives Matter moment, even though it seems to be passing, there is some momentum that HUD should use to push these, because they're continuing through their practices to perpetuate this, and it can't change unless they change.
I will say this, that our research shows that there's not only with appraisals, it's in lending practices, it's in real estate agent practices. There's discrimination baked in so many different things that people see as just natural practices, but they don't understand that many of them were developed during segregation, when it was, and that's a part, it was legal to discriminate. And when people say, for most of our history, legal to discriminate, and then, take 40, 50 years, right? People are saying, oh, there's no discrimination, knowing that so many of our industries were built off of this fact. So I would certainly look at, again, accountability is key, holding these different industries accountable, but also let's understand how we got out of the Great Depression. let's understand how, to a certain extent, we got out of this current pandemic. We gave direct subsidy to the injured, and so we need to replicate that for those who have been injured by past discrimination. And so that's what I would encourage the Biden administration to do.
I think it's very hard to control behavior, and the fact that HUD can kind of say like don't enforce this and then do enforce this says a lot about the ability to dissemble and sort of ignore and beat around the bush when these kinds of egregious offenses emerge. So I mean, one thing I'd like to see is a much more experimental attitude towards some of the solutions to these problems. I was reading recently in November, Harlem, East Harlem got the second community land trust in New York City, which is a way of essentially having community ownership through the land trust of the land, and then nonprofits rent the land to build affordable housing. And I think models like that are very encouraging as an alternative to just kind of trying to do a better job with, as I said, the cake is baked. If the cake doesn't have salt in it, you can't just shake salt on top of the cake and make the cake taste good. Some part of the cake is still going to not be very salty. So I think it's important to be willing to experiment in different ways. I think certainly community land trusts are one of those ways. I think, even though it's not about housing, paying people with children an allowance, as Andre is suggesting, is compelling too. Trying to sort of work around some of these baked in pathways would be really important.
We have a question from the audience. Is Manhattan seeing its last days of Black residents? Why isn't there more outcry about the displacements of Blacks in Harlem? And where's Black power now? And I think that can go across the country, that same question. So Andre.
I actually think there is a lot of outcry, and why I think Brian's work is important. We're seeing in Evanston, Illinois, for instance, they just instituted a reparations ordinance or fund. Now, a lot of people will criticize it and say, hey, that's not the federal government. But the reality is, particularly when it comes to housing, it wasn't just the federal government. It was federal, state, and local ordinances that sort of work together in order to develop the maps, the banking. Remember, all this, the private industry and government kind of work together to create all this. And so I think it's a step in the right direction and evidence that people are responding and demanding change, not just by marching in the streets, but changing policy. So we shouldn't look at that effort as sort of like an effort that is destined to fail. We should see this as a start towards developing local, state, and federal policies that will repair the damage that has been done.
Brian or Kevin? Can I add to that?
I mean, there's always these kinds of shades of gray and these kinds of assessments too. Harlem has had Black middle class people throughout the whole time. It still has Black middle class people. So, I do not think Harlem will ever have no Black people living in it, but I do think, the days of it as a kind of, it lost its position as the largest population of African Americans in New York a long time ago. Diane, we talked about this because it's part of your own story, but people moved out to the outer boroughs, but I think that probably has passed, but I think Black power is emergent in different forms. And I would again just point to something like the community land trusts. I think people really are trying to be quite creative in dealing with some of these things through community. I mean, even stuff like the move to mutual aid, which has been an astounding sort of outcome of the last year. The amount of mutual aid groups that have emerged that are not just talking about food for people, but housing aid, childcare. These are all alternatives to the kind of problems of capitalism in America's communities that cause things like displacement and are pretty compelling, even if they're self-made. They're really quite encouraging about other models that get outside of some of the exploitative frameworks that cause things like aggressive gentrification.
I mean, I lived in Harlem for 25 years before moving back to Ohio 9 years ago. So I lived through a lot of the changes that, at least the latter part of the changes that Brian talks about in his book. And the tension within the Black residents of Harlem is there are some who do benefit from the change and want to. And it's been that way all along, really, even in cases where it might be exploitive in some cases. And then there's another thread that wants Harlem to be a place where you can live regardless of your income. And that's the tension. And the political class has not been that latter group. They've tended to be the former. And they have played a key role in rezoning, in decisions. And so the idea about a community land trust, I also agree that, like, if I could go back and turn back the hands of time in the 80s, when I was part of a group founding the Abyssinian Development Corporation, we should have done that. We didn't. But so a lot of those properties that we developed in the 80s and 90s that were through the low-income housing tax credit, that was only a 15-year period of keeping them in that. And we thought the organization would stay committed to it. I left in 97, and the organization did not stay committed to it. And so a lot of those buildings have been sold. And a community land trust, you don't necessarily sidestep that, but its mission is to do that. And I'm on the board of a land trust in Yellow Springs, Ohio, where I live now. It's a CDC that uses the land trust model. And we should have done that years ago, because that's one way to, the people who want that have a place that is more permanent than trying to appeal to politicians can ever make it.
Can I just add quickly? I think what you're hearing is that we need alternatives to ownership model, alternatives to ownership, because of past discrimination, because of inequities. It's hard to actually create the inventory to, and particularly in some markets, it's almost close to impossible to buy given certain income levels. And so you really do need alternatives to what we currently have. And you're starting to see cooperatives and land trusts and and different things that, because what is central is that we almost have to have people be able to work and live relatively close to each other. It's untenable for people to have to work in one part of the city and live too far away. And this gets back to our sort of roots of discrimination. Folks want Black and brown labor. They don't want them to be neighbors, so, but we got to keep this focus on, in order for local economies to be healthy, we need overall environments where you can work and live in the same place. And we need different levels of income to be able to reside in the same place. And unfortunately, we just are now so fixated on curating our communities to be, this exclusive enclave of schools and homes, and it's really deteriorating our very notion of what a community can be and is. Oh, you're on mute.
There is a question for you.
Oh,
Andre. Have you completed any research in PG County, Maryland, as it relates to devaluing properties in communities where there's over 50% Black population?
Oh, of course. I mean, and I would actually, I'll put this in the chat. You can actually look at the interactive in the chat. You can scroll over the area that's close to you. If towards the bottom of that web page, you'll see a map, and you can scroll over and see the area that you're in, if it has enough Black people in it to make those kind of comparisons. But in the DMV metro, it's a 15% difference, about 48,000 per home. That's what we find. So, and we're also going to do deeper analysis here in the coming months on commercial properties as well. So we'll be adding on to that sort of portfolio of devaluation research that we're putting out.
Some other questions. It's an interesting one. To what extent was the destruction of Black communities and global philosophy of oppression reference Cape Town's middle of the night dislocation of Black people to townships in the 1930s? I guess the person is asking, is it a relationship? And can you model it back here to the United States?
It really wasn't a destruction. It was a creation of what racial segregation does in America is it steers Black people to certain neighborhoods to better exploit them. And so if you look at the period I was talking about in 1900 as Black people, the reason why there were Black people in Harlem at all in 1900 was because they could be charged higher rents. And so you look at newspapers in the 1880s and 1890s, in Harlem, landlords are advertising for respectable colored families in Harlem. And they want them there because they charge them more, 25 to 50% more. And so if we understand that, they want that to continue. And there are Black property owners who do the same thing. I mean, my book that comes out in July, Philip Payton, the father of Black Harlem, started the Afro-American Realty Company in 1904. Said he was going to bring about multiracial housing, but quickly adopted that pattern. And so that's what we're fighting against. And if you look at that really closely, it tells you the beginning of what Andre is looking at now. If you're charging people more for rent in a building, that building should be valued more. If you look at how you price buildings, you look at the revenue, you divide the total revenue by what a typical return is. In 1900, a typical return in real estate was 6%. And so it's not a complicated process to value, but somehow they're bringing the value down when the Black people they're charging them more. And there's no explanation other than that racial explanation. And so the neighborhoods do end up being destroyed in part because of the greed of the people who own the properties. They don't invest in them. They want to get every last penny out of them. But it wasn't a pogrom like I saw in the chat. It wasn't that, but you could almost call it a slow motion destruction instead.
Do you want
Just
Brian?
going to just add in this, if we fast forward to the 60s and kind of the 50s and 60s, the high point of urban redevelopment and highway construction, I think, a similar story is unfolding where there's often a kind of development is intersecting with existing racial dynamics in ways that often serve to punish Black people, even if the actors aren't, kind of acting in the explicit name of Jim Crow style racism. There's, political power is a medium through which racism operates implicitly, if not explicitly. So it may be that driving a highway through Wilmington's Black community in Delaware was a kind of technocratic decision by planners who were looking at maps and figuring out, where could they sort of find the path of least resistance. that path of least resistance, of course, is an index of political power where, if they had run it through a white middle class community, the backlash would have been much more severe. So you can see that. I will say, though, that, of course, and Isabel Wilkerson writes about this very well in her book Caste, which I'm sure many of you have read because it's a really well-read book. The US was something of a global model for racism and discrimination, and certainly urban renewal was exported. It was imported from elsewhere, but it was also exported to other places. South Korea was one example, certainly colonial context in Africa and other places too. So there is a way that the global conversation is very relevant here, even if it wasn't always as direct maybe as we might imagine.
We have about, well, actually we're over, but I
Can
just,
I just add this?
I was going to give you a chance to close. Yes, absolutely.
And I'll close the as the last question pertains to the last question. There are clear connections between white supremacy, colonization, I should say colonization, white supremacy, and apartheid. And it might look different in some respects, but at the root, they used a racial hierarchy of values to determine how to orchestrate society. So there are certainly connections there. But I just want to encourage all of you to continue this work on discrimination. I mean, since we released that report on home values almost 3 years ago, since then, there's been a slew of other studies that take our model and to really isolate race and to look at values overall. So now you have things on tax assessments, appraisals, all kind of things. And while these were certainly issues, since we can remember, since they were developed, I think now you're starting to see a flood of research and activity that we haven't seen in the past, and people are hearing it. So I just want students, if you're listening, and faculty, if you're listening, keep doing this work. It is actually paying off. The researchers from 20, 30 years ago are seeing the fruit of their labor in our work today. So just keep working on these issues.
Closing remarks, Kevin or Brian?
Just to kind of take a detour, I guess, as a closing remark, I think we haven't really talked about schools. The schools are so much at the, I'm kind of, starting to make a decision about whether I might want to go from being a renter to an owner, and just schools are the mediator for all of these decisions in ways that are so intractable and so just completely overwhelming. And I think, it just reminds me, pushing money to kids, putting money into schools, building infrastructure, just in my kind of earlier point about experimenting and thinking about this in indirect ways, I think, that is one way that a lot of the effects of redlining show up and might also be unwound in ways that aren't about, new ownership models or about even political power, but just about acknowledging that, children have to be invested in and given safe, good places to learn. And a lot of these other things would follow from, a strong generation of investment in kids, I would hope.
Interesting that you say that. I and many of my friends were bussed out of our Black neighborhood, our Black middle class neighborhood. That's an interesting point. Some people say taking talent out, putting them in white neighborhoods. Kevin, did you closing?
Yes, I think that what we're talking about, this inequality and racism within housing, I think it is the core to solving the problem of inequality in our society. And if we can't do that, we can't achieve equality. So the housing link, the wealth link, just even who we are, the fact that when we say Black neighborhood, most of us know what that means, and it's not positive. And Andre's research is showing that it shouldn't be that way. So how do we, and I'm very interested in kind of using my work and the work of others to push us to unlearn what we think we know. But the facts are really saying something very different. And it is a moment, I do believe, that where we're talking about inequality, and this happens every, generation or so, but I think we've got some tools that those who came before us didn't have that we should use to do this.
I'm not sure if Patrice is still on. If you want to close, Patrice.
I am here, thank you, Diane, but no, I'd rather you please sum up. Fantastic insights and invaluable for us to understand these issues. Thank you.
And I thank the panelists. This is so important. With education, you can move only with education. And what you do is so important to us all. Thank you.
Thank you.